All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a grade 8 U.S. history topic that is absolutely crucial to understanding the American story: expansion, reform, and indigenous displacement. We're going to uncover exactly how a massive revolution in transportation back in the early 1800s set off a giant cause and effect chain reaction, one that led straight to the American Civil War. It's a fascinating, deeply complex narrative, and we're going to trace it step by step.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with markets and transportation, move to expansion and indigenous displacement, then cover antebellum reform movements, the Mexican-American War, and finally end with the expansion of slavery.
So, Section 1, Markets and Transportation, the catalyst for change.
Think about how wild this must have felt. American investors and the government basically rewired the entire landscape by building this vast new infrastructure of roads, turnpikes, canals, and railroads. Almost overnight, the time it took to travel shrank drastically. People were just marveling at their new ability to conquer massive distances. But it wasn't just about moving people, it was about moving stuff. This revolution made it possible to ship agricultural and manufactured goods nationally. It created this vibrant capitalist republic where folks could easily travel to towns and cities for jobs, and it completely revolutionized the American economy.
Okay, before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's do a quick pause check to test our historical thinking. Based on what we just covered about these new networks, how exactly did the transportation revolution affect westward expansion? Take a second to really think about it.
Well, the reasoning is pretty straightforward. Because the transportation network expanded, it literally shrank the map. It allowed everyday people to ship their crops and goods back to national markets, which drove an absolute frenzy to buy up public land in the West. Thousands upon thousands rushed westward to get a piece of the pie, sparking some intense land speculation.
Moving right along to Section 2, Expansion and Indigenous Displacement, the push west.
You see, this relentless push wasn't just an economic reality. It actually morphed into a deeply held belief. This was driven by manifest destiny. Now, that's the enduring ideology that basically justified taking Western lands to expand American influence and power. It was this widespread belief that expanding across the North American continent wasn't just inevitable, it was a righteous mission.
Now, it is absolutely vital to distinguish historical claims from actual historical evidence here. While expansionists claimed they were just naturally and progressively expanding the boundaries of the Republic, the historical evidence tells a much harsher story. The reality is that this whole economic and ideological drive directly caused the forced, violent displacement of native peoples. That popular animosity became actual domestic policy, culminating in the 1830 Indian Removal Act, which mandated the forced removal of the 5 civilized tribes from the southeast by the U.S. military. And tragically, even a ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court offered them no protection.
Which brings us to Section 3, Antebellum Reform Movements, the social response.
So, how did society respond to all these massive shifts? With antebellum reform movements, people were really trying to build a more equitable world. We see the Second Great Awakening, where evangelical Protestantism sparked this intense belief that individuals could take charge of their own salvation and actually change society for the better. Reformers started targeting what they saw as national vices. For example, they created temperance organizations to combat rampant alcohol abuse, back when the U.S. seemed to many like a republic of drunkenness. We also saw utopian communal experiments, trying to totally rethink economic relationships. And crucially, this era saw the rise of abolitionism. Led by folks like William Lloyd Garrison, these reformers provoked massive reactions by envisioning a United States entirely without slavery, where black and white people stood on equal footing.
And the crazy thing is, these reforms were all highly interconnected. In fact, as reformers looked around, they realized that abolition played a major role in generating the early feminist movement in the United States. Even though it didn't immediately lead to voting rights for women, getting involved in these reform movements kicked off the long, hard process of fighting gender inequality in the Republic.
All right, Section 4, the Mexican-American War, the Imperial Conflict.
Because of that unrelenting pressure to expand, Americans essentially orchestrated violence against Mexico. It all started with Texas. Driven largely by slaveholders, American settlers declared independence in 1836, forming their own republic where slavery was fully legal. But they kept pressing for more land. This incredibly strained relationship finally snapped in 1846 with the outbreak of the Mexican-American War under President James K. Polk. By 1848, the war ended and the United States established the border at the Rio Grande, fundamentally and permanently changing the map of North America.
The sheer scale of the 1848 Mexican cession was just staggering.
We're talking about the U.S. acquiring nearly half of Mexico's entire territory, including what is now New Mexico and California. Almost instantly, the California gold rush hits and the population out there just explodes. But we absolutely have to recognize that this rapid, chaotic influx led to a massive and devastating loss of Native American life in the region.
Finally, Section 5. The expansion of slavery, the ultimate consequence.
Grabbing all these huge Western territories completely shattered the fragile political balance of the United States. It created what became known as the dilemma of the West. On one side, Northern reformers and the newly formed Free Soil Party were demanding that slavery be entirely barred from the Mexican cession. But on the flip side, Southern slaveholders saw acquiring these lands as the logical, necessary next step to expand their economic system.
Let's hit our second pause check for this explainer to really lock this concept in. Why exactly did the land gain from Mexico threaten the very existence of the Union?
Well, the reasoning is that it destroyed the political peace. It reawakened this incredibly bitter, rancorous debate, forcing the entire nation to immediately decide if slavery was going to expand into these vast new Western territories or be restricted. And once that debate was reopened, the dominoes fell so fast. First, the Compromise of 1850 tries to settle things, but its Fugitive Slave Act, which actually made it a crime not to help capture escaped slaves, deeply, deeply inflames Northern anger. Then, the Kansas-Nebraska Act tries to use popular sovereignty, but that just opens the door to outright chaos and violence as pro-slavery and free soil forces physically clash in Kansas. After that, the 1857 Dred Scott decision declares that African Americans can never be citizens and Congress can't stop the expansion of slavery, which absolutely outrages Republicans. And finally, Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860 is the watershed moment that triggers the secession of Southern states, leading straight to the bombardment of Fort Sumter and the Civil War.
So, to quickly recap the massive chain reaction we've traced in this explainer, it all started when the transportation revolution sparked a huge demand for land. That economic demand fueled the ideology of manifest destiny and the horrific reality of indigenous displacement. Meanwhile, all these rapid societal changes sparked antebellum social reform movements, like abolitionism. At the same time, expansionist pressure caused a war with Mexico. And ultimately, that new Western territory reignited the explosive debate over the expansion of slavery, culminating in the American Civil War. As we wrap up this explainer, I wanted to leave you with one final thought, a way to connect all this history to our world right now. Just as canals and railroads drove a massive rush westward in the 1800s, ask yourself, how do economic shifts in new technologies continue to drive population migrations today? Think about how geography and economics still shape where and why people move. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and keep asking those big historical questions.